if this is something you choose it with passion, choose it with a love. Don't get caught up in the milliseconds, because once you have those babies in your arms and you take them home, it's going to be worth it. And it's not going to matter where they came from or that they don't share your biology. You're going to be a family, and that will be all worth it.
Family building is supposed to be easy, and it can be a shock when it's not. The roller coaster ride of infertility can be a mix of emotions and conflicting advice along the way. As a reproductive endocrinologist and former fertility patient, I not only help patients build families every day, but I remember what the ride was like for me. Hang on tight as we learn together from experts and share stories from infertility warriors with compassion. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and this is Baby or Bust. There are many ways to build a family, and today we're talking about adoption. Whether you've always known this is right for you, or whether you're considering it after experiencing infertility, getting started can be overwhelming. Domestic adoption versus international adoption, agency versus private, open versus closed. There's so many options, there's so many assumptions, myths, and emotions that go along with this decision. Here to share her own story of adoption after infertility is licensed marriage and family therapist, author, and public speaker, Cathie Quillet. Cathie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Laura, for inviting me on.
I am so thankful for how open you are about your own journey, whether it's in your book or your own podcast. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey to adoption as a way to build your family?
Yeah. So I always thought that adoption was a really great option, but in my really what I consider past tense kind of narrow-minded view of how to build a family, it's just something other people did. And I really honored that story for a lot of other people, but I was going to have biological children. And then if we had extra rooms in our house, then adoption felt like an okay option. Infertility for us wove itself into our relationship about a year into marriage. I'm a therapist and I sit for a living, and I started being unable to sit. That took me to the doctor. I was diagnosed with endometriosis, and I remember waking up from my surgery and my husband saying, "Honey, I don't know everything down there, but if it's down there, it's covered."
Mm. And so you mean you sit for a living, but you were in so much pain from endometriosis that you couldn't sit. Oh my goodness.
It was almost like I needed an inner tube, except for the fact that my hips hurt that bad also. It was excruciating. So my doctor suggested after our diagnosis that we do one of three things, which I'm sure you probably give to your patients also: artificial menopause, which is Lupron, or birth control. And hormones and I just do not do well together. My husband kind of vetoed that for me, knowing what his life I'm sure would have been like. And the other was that we could try to conceive in an effort to fight off the infertility. And so that felt, we were kind of a year ahead of schedule from the plan that we had, but try to conceive we did. 8 months later, I was pregnant, elated, and we were having a baby. We were still at this place in our life that, again, miscarriage also happened to somebody else. About 10, 11 weeks after finding out that we were pregnant, we found out that our sweet little peanut no longer had a heartbeat. We grieved, and then we started trying again. And in that time, I was diagnosed with a pretty aggressive form of polycystic ovaries. Like, it was just pretty bad. And in that time, this is totally unrelated, but I also lost my gallbladder. And when you're trying to conceive, anytime that there is you have to take any amount of time off, it feels so inconvenient and massive. And so those 2-3 months that we had to take off between diagnosis and surgery and recovery felt like a monstrosity.
Absolutely. You described so many times how you have a plan, you have a narrative, and it got derailed multiple times.
And so we started trying again upon recovery, and then I got pregnant again, and that one was with us for 5 weeks. And then got pregnant a couple months later, and that one was with us for 6. And then another one a couple months later, and that was with us for 7 weeks. So I had 4 miscarriages in total. And so I went to my local IVF clinic and they did all the testing and he was like, I'm so sorry. We can't even implant. There's no healthy tissue left in your uterus. So at 32, I had a partial hysterectomy. And a couple years later, my last remaining ovary twisted and died, and I was internally bleeding. And so I had an emergency oophorectomy.
But you have taken your experience and absolutely used your story to help others, and just like you're doing now. So I really appreciate your sharing. When you were going through your family building struggles and infertility, did anyone say to you, just adopt? Because it's so sensitive. People really think they're helping, like, oh, just adopt. Like, it's so easy. And that will be an answer to your problem. Your problem is you don't have children, you want them. And so just go get some.
Right. In my world of mental health, we call infertility now a reproductive trauma. Like taking somebody else's baby and bringing it into your home cures a trauma. Pregnancy doesn't cure the mental health implications of infertility, so adoption certainly doesn't. We supported people in their adoption, financially, emotionally, whatever, but it just didn't feel like it was our story yet.
How did that change?
I had this picture in my mind of my husband and myself. And of course, being an 80s child in San Diego, the picture would have been denim on the beach, barefoot. So that was the narrative that we had built for ourselves, was that we were going to have 2, maybe 3 kids. And so once that started, I started realizing after each diagnosis, each surgery, each month that went by, maybe this isn't my journey. And it was like this picture that I had identified on the wall of what my family was going to look like. It was almost like the faces in it started to fade. They didn't look like my husband and I anymore. It was just this different set where I just felt life pivoting a little bit more. I also spent a lot of time begging God, like, just knock me up and make it stick.
Mm-hmm.
Knock me up and make it stick. Like, it's that specific. And then it turned to just this questioning, do our kids have to carry our biology? So like so many people, we stood at this crossroads between we do IVF, we elect childlessness, or we adopt. And IVF ruled it, or any type of fertility treatment ruled itself out right away. Our clinic looked at my scans and was like, this is just not going to work for you. And then he's like, but we're going to run a couple more tests. And then his nurse called me like a couple days later and was like, all right, he was right. You can't have kids. Good luck to you.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, hi, added trauma.
Wow. Yeah.
But while we were even sitting in that clinic waiting room, we had already sent out all of these feelers into the adoption world and started interviewing all of these clinics. And while we're getting all of these no's, we kept getting all of these yeses. And I think you get to this point, we got to this point where you have to ask yourself, do you want a biological child? Do you want to be a mother? Or do you want to be pregnant? I don't know why. For some reason, I never pictured myself pregnant. Me birthing somebody was never important to me. Do we work really hard to make these babies? Or do we welcome in the babies that might not have a chance? And so it was really an easy no-brainer for us to bring in the children that we knew didn't have a chance. And can I tell you something that's so beautiful? We went down to the beach. We were in Fort Lauderdale, I don't know, it was January sometime of this year. And I went and looked for sand dollars because that was something my mama and I always did together. And I was walking back and there was my husband, and my children are adopted from Ethiopia. So my 2 Black children. And I thought to myself, I could have missed this. If my pleads and prayers and hopes and dreams for biological children would have come true, if God would have knocked me up and made it stick, I could have missed this. Like, those boys are so my babies. I get these 2 kids that I could have missed. So they'll be home 8 years this year. We just celebrated this last Sunday, their referral anniversary, the day that we learned about them 8 years ago. And there's not a part of me that's like, oh, well, I wish I would have had biological children. Those are my kids. I'll fight you over them.
Once you make that decision, and I really appreciate you walking us through that journey and that decision, how did you find out more information? Because you were just talking about how you were at a time where there wasn't really Instagram or Facebook groups or a lot of resources for fertility. But what about for adoption? How did you navigate that?
We knew one couple that had adopted, and they lived a couple hours away from us. And we just went and spent the weekend with them and asked them everything. And they were really helpful for us. Infertility makes you feel so out of control. I felt like there was nothing I could do to help myself. And then you go into this new season of adoption, which, again, like my own story, it's always somebody else's story. I didn't know where to look. And so I Googled most places within 60 miles of where we lived, and I just started interviewing.
Did you know early on that you were interested in international adoption? Because I think that there's like once you make the decision to adopt, then there's so many different options. And is it better to focus or cast a wide net, or how did you get down your path?
To start the process of adoption, you need to know because different agencies specialize in different things. Like the agency we did our home study with specialized in domestic adoptions, but they were the closest to us that could help us do our home study. We did our home study with them, and then we had to interview different agencies that were going to help us with the Ethiopian portion of our adoption.
I mean, I talk to patients all the time about adoption. I was really interested in talking with you about this because so many times I'm going through options with my patients and it's like, listen, we could continue to try it. We could do another cycle. We could do donor egg. We could do anonymous embryo. Or have you thought about adoption or even child free? I mean, literally go through everything. And people say, oh, well, I've always thought about adoption. Like, how can I learn more? And I just have always said it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. And in preparation for this, I learned so much more. And I'm really excited to provide that. And some of the hesitations a lot of my patients have are just, this is not my story. This is not my narrative. Am I going to love these children?
I think something that comes up for me when I remember is the question that we tossed around between my husband and I is how are the people in our family circle, how are the people in our immediate community going to interact with these kids? I always say that adopted is a past tense verb, not an adjective. My children came through adoption. They're not my adopted children. They came through adoption. We don't call your children vagina children or cesarean children.
Yeah.
These are just my kids that came into my family through a different way. We're not used to that narrative. My 8-year-old, my youngest, has autism, and we call him autistic. And I resent when people say that because all of a sudden that's a label that's more important than anything else. My son is Bowen, and he happens to struggle with a neurological condition called autism. We might struggle with infertility, but we are not infertile humans. We struggle against it. My mom struggled with cancer. We didn't call her cancer or cancerous because we kind of have a better understanding about it in society. Especially in this world, we put adjectives on something that don't belong. I'm just Cathie. I'm not my diagnosis. I'm a wife. I'm a mom. I'm a therapist. But the things that I struggle against, or struggle with, are not my identity. That's not who you are. You're not weak. You're not lonely. You're not all of these things. You're struggling through, again, what we call a reproductive trauma, and that is hard work. Whether or not we can have babies or make them or lose them or whatever, our femininity, the thing that makes us nurturing and warm and whatever, that is the thing that will also make us great moms, regardless of how they come to us.
And I love hearing from people that have children come into their lives in multiple different ways. A celebrity that you can think of is maybe Nicole Kidman, who has birthed one child, but she has also adopted 2 children and had a child through surrogacy. And she's so open about being a mother and loving these children to the end of the earth, regardless of how they come into her life, and not feeling differently about these children, whether they came out of her body or they were adopted. And I don't have that personal life experience. I love hearing that from someone that's willing to share that. I think there's this feeling that there's a lot of children out there to be adopted and that it's an easy and quick process. I looked it up. It's on the Adoption Network. It says about 140,000 children are adopted in the United States each year. Of the non-step parent adoptions, about 59% are from the foster system. 26% are from other countries like international adoption, and 15% are from, they describe, voluntarily relinquished Americans.
I mean, I remember there was some statistic floating around 8 years ago when we did this that said if you got every orphan or child that could be adopted in the entire world and put them outstretched arm to outstretched arm, you could go around the globe twice.
But I was surprised too by how many people are waiting for adoption. 1 to 2 million families are waiting. And so I think that it is more of a process than people might realize. Can you tell me a little bit more about the time it takes to get ready to adopt and then the waiting period? Because I think there's a misconception about how fast it can go.
Here are the steps of the process. This is if you're going to use an agency. First, you do your initial application, then you do your real application, and each of those can take a month or so. And then you do your home study, the elusive home study, which in some places can take several months. Like we lived on a well at that time, and we had to have somebody come check our well. And we needed to have the fire department come out and make sure our fire extinguishers were in place. All these things that if you bring home a baby from the hospital, you don't have to do, which is crazy. But I guess it makes a lot of sense if you're bringing in a human biological to somebody else. And then once all of that is done, then you're what we call paper pregnant. And from there, that's when the waiting begins. So you're already, in some cases, like for us, we were already 8 months in to our journey before we became paper pregnant. And at that time, they told us 12 to 16 months. So you're thinking that's almost 2 gestational periods that I could have gone through to bring home my 2 children.
I also think there's a misconception about cost. I honestly had never thought before this podcast, like, I wonder how much it does cost. And in my research, I found anywhere from maybe $20,000 to $60,000 for the process, depending on many things, like whether it's private, like within the United States, international travel costs. Is that your understanding of the general cost for you and your clients, I guess?
Yeah, I would say typically it's even above 20. I usually say 30 to 50. I think 60 is probably fair. We brought home, just full disclosure, 2 kids at $55,000. I think when we first started the process and we looked at it and thought, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to afford this? And what is all this money for? 2 things. There are so many grants and scholarships. If you think, oh my gosh, the Quillets have $55,000 sitting around, that's wrong. People were so happy to help us, and people want to bring home people into their families, but they also want to help people take care of orphans. I think most people have a heart for orphans, but not everybody can bring them into their home. People were very quick to give through that process, but also it started, Laura, making a lot of sense to us where that money was going. We had to pay $2,500 per kid to the welfare of other orphans in Ethiopia. And up front, we thought, why on earth do we have to do that? We're going to bring home 2 of Ethiopians' children. Isn't that like enough? But then we went to the country twice and we fell in love with it. And the hardest thing about leaving with our kids was seeing the other millions of orphans who were honestly being left behind. And so in that point in the process, $2,500 a kid felt like, for the humanitarian efforts, felt totally worth it. Why is it so expensive? That's a question that we got all the time. And how it was best described to us from our agency was they have to make it expensive for child traffickers. And knowing that we were paying a cost that would weed out the people who would want to traffic these children, I was like, I'll pay whatever you want me to do. I want to raise them and nurture and love. Like, this is beautiful and sacred. And if I get two people out of that system, as warped as that is to even think that way, it felt totally worth every dime.
There is a wonderful resource that I heard about in a little bit of my research was the book by Julie Gum, You Can Adopt Without Debt, Creative Ways to Cover the Cost of Adoption. I heard her on a podcast and she went through adoption herself and had to raise tens of thousands of dollars and just did really creative things, whether it was crowdfunding. She picked up a paper route. She just worked through a lot of different and very creative ways. And I just wanted to talk about that resource because I thought that was a really fun resource for us.
That's awesome. Infertility robs you of a lot. And one of those things that infertility robs you of is the ability to expand your family for free. You know, every step that becomes more complicated, it just becomes more expensive. I think in infertility and adoption, once you realize you have no control, you have control. There's no other way to get control. There are steps in adoption that you can take that are going to give you control. You can fill out the application. You can go complete your dossier, which is paperwork you have to send to a different country. You can call your attorney. You can return phone calls. You don't have control over when they're going to call you back. You don't have control over which family is going to choose you. You don't have control over if this mama in her 3 days that she can surrender the child, if she's going to still choose to do that. You might have loved and nurtured this child, and then she decides, you know what, I want to love and nurture this child, and she has every right to. There is so much out of control that realizing you're out of control really sets you up for parenthood. Because I think, Laura, what we can identify as parents is it's a constant feeling of feeling out of control. And I think if we can just take that out of our vocabulary, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have a baby here by Christmas. By Mother's Day, I'm gonna be a mama. All those things just give us this arbitrary timeline that really, I think a lot of times in hindsight becomes something that hurts us. I want to be a mom by Christmas, but I can't say I'm going to be, even though I'm next on the wait list for adoption.
Any challenges that are unique to raising children from a different race?
It is so hard. I remember filling out that questionnaire and they really ask you everything. Are you open to cleft palate? Are you open to congenital heart defects? Are you open to spina bifida? Are you open to a drug addicted baby? Adopting international, there was so much that we didn't know. The only thing we know about our children's birth parents are that they're Black. That's it. Choosing birth parents here, you might get to know a little bit more of the family's biological history or their social history. So you have to answer a lot of those questions, which is really complicated. We stumbled through it and we had to make the hard decision at the time that we were not going to take on really bad physical challenges with a child. And that was so hard for us to say because we wanted to love those children. But being in the cornfields of Ohio, we lived 3 hours away from the closest specialized medical center. That's 6 hours a day in a car with already physical challenges to put them through. And we didn't think that was fair. Not even to mention, as you're talking about, Laura, these social challenges. And again, the stupid things that people say. Why couldn't you buy white? Are those your adopted children? What's wrong with you that you couldn't have your own? It is complicated to raise children of a different ethnicity. And I know I do that by choice. It is also hard to raise children when they say, well, where do I get this? And the answer is, I don't know, buddy. Or when you go to the doctor's office and they say, tell me about the child's birth. And I very boldly on each one say, I don't know, this is insensitive. Because the paperwork for that is like writing on, I wish I could redo all medical forms. Like, why, when we go to a doctor's office as infertile people, do we have to write how many pregnancies? 4. How many live births? 0. I know it's easier for them to like put information into online forms. My paperwork says, tell me about your reproductive journey. I can read about it. And so as a mom through adoption, to have these pages of questionnaires that I just have to put a question mark. It's hard, but it's also hard when the child has to see that. I love what we did, and I don't know that we did it right, but we did it right for us. From the moment that we decided to adopt till the second these babies met their families here in America, we took pictures and documented everything. We have 3 Shutterfly books that document our children coming into our family because for a lot of times adoption is written out of a story of abandonment and rejection. Even if the abandonment is out of love, which I choose to believe that my children's birth parents left them in an orphanage out of love. But anytime they want to say, Mama, would you go to Ethiopia for me again? Yeah, let's go look at the book, buddy. Do you see everything that we did? Even when the questions come up, which they do, like, what did I look like as a baby? I don't know what you look like before 19 months, but look at this is the baby picture we have of you. It's this story of acceptance and love and pursuit that we wrote for them in these books that doesn't override the system of abandonment, but anytime that there's a question, I don't care about the questions for anybody else. Your questions mean nothing to me. Your opinions mean even less. These are my babies and this is my family. Your judgment is not welcome here. You're creating your family, how you want to create your family, and the creation of that family is right.
And I think that goes for so many things. I mean, there's stigma around using IVF to start your family. There's stigma around using donor sperm or surrogacy and adoption. People are going to have their own opinions. And I love that you say, I don't know if it's right. I know it's right for me. So, Cathie, should everyone adopt?
As much as I love adoption, Laura, I don't believe so. I think we're all called to take care of orphans and children, but I don't think that everybody is called to or should bring them into their home to raise. I remind my clients all the time, as I had to remind myself, that this decision is not just bringing a baby into your home. This is raising this child. This is launching this child from your home. This is walking them down the aisle. This is them putting you in a home. This is till death do you part, this arrangement. There's been influencers in the news lately because they want to get rid of their children through adoption. Like, we had to raise our hand in front of an Ethiopian judge and say, I promise and vow that this will be my child and I will love them as my child and for the duration of their life. So help me God in front of these judges. It was the most emotional experience, but I knew that these babies were going to be ours. There's no turning back. These are my babies as much as anybody else's babies that might come to them through their own biology. Adoption is not just bringing a child home. It's the lifelong commitment to raise a human.
It's important to think it through and to learn and to really be committed to it. And if you decide not to, that's also okay. I think that's really, really important for people to hear.
It's so brave. I have so many clients that are like, I'll be like, hey, what have you thought about adoption? Yeah, not for me. You are so brave to make that boundary for yourself and to know yourself well enough to know that adoption's not for you. What else is for you? Let's start writing that narrative.
Can you think back 9, 10 years ago, what you would have wanted to hear when you were making that decision?
I think something that was so big for me was this is going to take forever. I want to be a mom yesterday. And I remember sitting, so this is morbid, but go with me here. Life always ends for me in a hospice bed. Just go with me. And my perspective is if I'm going to be thinking about this in my hospice bed at the end of everything, it matters. And those days and those weeks and those hours mattered so much to me in the middle of infertility. Like, what day is it? Am I ovulating? How many days am I going to have to wait for this? What if I don't get chosen for these babies this month? In hindsight, for me, I don't remember all the intricacies of it, but the intricacies of the details of the waiting and the phone calls and everything and how quickly they did or did not come felt so enormous in the story of my life. If this is something you choose it with passion, choose it with a love. Don't get caught up in the milliseconds. because once you have those babies in your arms and you take them home, it's going to be worth it. And it's not going to matter where they came from, or that they don't share your biology, or that it take you a little bit longer to get them. You're going to be a family, and that will be all worth it.
Thank you so much for being here today, Cathie, and sharing your story. How can our listeners find you?
So I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I own Tennessee Reproductive Therapy. You can find me on Instagram at Tennessee Reproductive Therapy. I also own a coaching business called the Quillet Institute. You can find me at the Quillet Institute. Or I'm Becoming Maternal on Instagram.
And we can find your book, Not Pregnant, at Amazon.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, Cathie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed our conversation with Cathie Quillet, and I appreciate her willingness to share her own story of infertility and family building through adoption. She reminds us that infertility is a disease, but it does not define us, and that adoption is one option for family building that may be right for you. But if you're thinking about it, we've got some steps to think through how to move forward. And the best reminder is that family is defined by love, not biology. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and this is Baby or Bust. If you like this episode, let us know. Give us a 5-star review and follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Baby or Bust is produced by Mark Ramsey, Jamie Solis, and Greg Moga. Executive produced by Paul Anderson, Nick Pinella, and Andrew Greenwood for Workhouse Media. Baby or Bust is a Mark Ramsey media production.